Well, as Stephen said, and if you've been here in the past weeks, if not months, I don't know how long you've been going through missions. It feels like a good little bit of time. Few weeks? In a good way. But we're going to be ending the mission series on looking at several different men's lives throughout church history. We're starting with William Carey. William Carey is known for being the father of modern missions, which kind of makes you think, like, well, what does that even mean, modern missions? But William Carey, a very ordinary man, the Lord used in many great ways. If you look at William Carey's life, you can see it reflects a lot of works, but his primary focus was most of his life was spent in India, serving the people of India, translating the Bible into 6 different languages throughout his life, and ultimately getting the word out in the people's tongue and having it boldly preached to them, seeing people come to faith and then training men up in their area. That's what William Carey did broadly. But for sake of outline today, I kind of struggled with coming up with like a handout. I was like, this isn't like a lesson on the Bible necessarily. We're looking at a guy's life. So I gave you guys an outline, real simple bullet points here. We're going to start off looking at the early years of William Carey, kind of like how he was raised, where he came to faith, how the Lord began to work in his life. Then we're going to transition to his calling into missions, really his calling into the pastorate ministry, but also into missions. Then we're also going to spend some time in groups. On the back of your handout, I have another section that we're going to spend a few minutes in, where Carey had to deal with a big theological controversy in that time on if the Great Commission is still binding to us today. So we're going to look at that a little bit. Then we're going to look into the first 7 years of Carey's ministry, and then really the rest of his life at the Serampore missions community he established in India in 1800. So that's kind of the outline. That's what we're going to see. I'm going to do a lot of talking. We're going to try to spare you guys, just giving you a bunch, just spilling information on you. I don't want this to be like a history class. I want it to be helpful and beneficial. The more I looked at William Carey's life, the more I'm like, honestly, every year of this guy's life could be its own Sunday school lesson. So I have the privilege of compiling that and just trying to make a concise 40-ish, 50-ish minute lesson on him. But let's start from the top, the early years of William Carey. He was born in 1761 in Northamptonshire, England, into a poor family. He was about as average as an average person gets. He wasn't born into a privileged family of any sorts. His dad, though, was the parish clerk of his town. He became the parish clerk when Carey's about 5 years old. They went to a church. It was the Church of England at the time, though. It was a Protestant church. We know from church history that they separated. They were Protestant. They weren't Catholic anymore. But his dad was very involved in church. Carey went to church a ton. He was a church kid. His dad was responsible for announcing the hymns, saying amen at the end of it. He was in charge of giving structure to the service of the church. He was in charge of knowing he was coming and going from the church. He was sick. He led a lot of the structure of the church, so to say. So Carey was at church a lot growing up. But it's sad to hear when you look at Carey and as he reflected back on his early days in church. Carey says, I remember having the Psalms read to me nearly daily, the Bible read to me all the time, but all he saw at a young age was what he would call an experimental religion. He saw a lot of fake people in the church, a lot of hypocrites, a lot of people that would come to church, but ultimately there's nothing really there in their personal lives. He called it experimental religion, and he said that's all he saw until he was about 14 years old. From a young age, Carey was very interested in traveling the world. You got to think this is the mid-1700s. People are getting on ships and taking giant voyages across the world. It's becoming a new thing. People are hearing back from people who are traveling the world. Carey was very interested in other countries and what life was like. He would even hear stories from his uncle who fought in the French and Indian War in Canada. And he came back to England, and he would hear stories from a young age of his uncle going to a new land, and they spoke a different language and lived a very different way. And that fascinated Carey at a young age. Carey wasn't known for being loving school. He wasn't a scholar by any means, especially young. But I find it amazing that even though he didn't love school, he would ultimately drop out before high school got there. At the age 11, he found a small book, a small textbook on Latin his dad had. He began to teach himself Latin at 11 years old. Now, if you guys have kids in the room, when your 11-year-old starts complaining about being bored, give them a Latin textbook and see what happens. Can you imagine that? 11-year-old boy says, I'm just going to start teaching myself Latin. Sheesh. Carey wasn't known for being a smart kid by any means, but it did seem like languages came naturally to him. Very naturally. Again, in his mid-teens, roughly around 14, he dropped out of school. Instead of doing what we would consider high school and then into college, his family was poor, they couldn't afford it. He dropped out of school and to work under a local shoemaker as an apprentice. So he was going to learn how to make shoes and just work in the trades of working at a shoe shop and making shoes. That was his path, and that was his path for the rest of his life if he was decent at it, and that's where most people in his day and age would do. They would find a skill, and that's what they would do for a living. However, as he's working under this shoemaker, he comes to meet one of his first important friends. As you're listening and learning from William Carey, one major fact that stands out in his life is his relationships with people. He established lifelong relationships, even at a young age, that deeply impacted him. The first one of which was a guy by the name of John Warr. Another boy, roughly Carey's age. He was apprentice under the same shoemaker, but John was a Christian. John Warr was a Baptist, and he would talk to William Carey about his faith and what he did. At the time, Carey was still of a Church of England, which was an Anglican church. And he was very against being friends with even people of other denominations. He wanted nothing to do with them at first. Especially at the time, the Baptists, the Congregational Baptists at the time, they were not looked proudly upon by the Anglicans by any means. But by the witness of John Warr, ultimately God would use him to bring Carey to faith. So John Warr continues to witness to Carey, talk about the Bible with him at a young age. John Warr even invites him ultimately to a prayer meeting on a Wednesday night. Now think about this. If you're going to invite your friend to church, Wednesday night prayer meeting may not be the thing you invite him for. Hey, we're just going to pray for an hour. You want to come? It's great. It may not be the first thing you invite somebody to. But over the course of 2 years, John and Carey would work together nearly daily, studying the trade of being a shoemaker. Carey began to go to these prayer meetings from time to time. He doesn't write much about it in his journals, but what he does emphasize during this time is his conviction of sin. He began for the first time to be aware of his own sinfulness. There is somewhat of a funny story. Carey, the person he's studying under to make shoes, said, hey, Carey, I need you to go to the town about 10 miles down the road. Here's a pouch of money. I need you to go buy material. This is like his first big boy job. He's like, sweet, I got this. So he's going there, and by the time he gets there, he dumps all the money to pay for this material, but there's one coin left. It wasn't as planned. So for the first time, he's like, oh, sweet, I can just pocket this extra coin instead of being honest with what's going on. So he puts it in his pocket. He gets back to his apprentice. He finds out, and he gets scolded by him, and then the rest of the town finds out that Carey lied about it, and he tried to take the money and run, so to speak. But it was around this time in his late teens where Carey was convicted of sin. During this 2 years of talking to John Warr, he ultimately would come to faith. He would be baptized, and he would soon after leave the Anglican church. Leaving the Anglican church was hard for him because that's where his whole family was. That's where he grew up. That's where his dad was very involved. But he ultimately saw a lack of gospel preaching there and an error in doctrines that he said, I can't put up with. I need to leave, and became a Baptist, was baptized. Soon after this, Carey had a desire to preach. He had a growing desire to preach. If we fast forward to 1787, Carey in his mid-20s, Carey would be ordained to be a pastor and began to pastor a small church in the area. And this is where Carey's conviction began to continue to grow It went from an interest into overseas life, what life is like in other countries, what life is like in other places of the world. Then when he came to faith, that transitioned to, well, how are these people hearing the gospel? Do these people even have the Bible in their language? Are there churches there? So his same desire and passion he had at a young age continued to grow and shape. And this is what leads us into his calling into missions. Soon after being ordained, Carey went to somewhat of what we would call like a pastor's conference in today's world. He met up with a bunch of local pastors. They would listen to his sermons and talk, theology talk. But Carey was one of the younger ordained ministers at the time there, so the older guys said, hey, Carey, do you have any questions? Anything you're wrestling with? Anything we can help with? And Carey posed a question that has been on his mind, and it's something we're going to look at today as a group. He asked the question, and this is a quote from him, whether the command given to the apostles to teach all nations was not binding on all succeeding ministers to the end of the earth, to the end of the world, seeing that the accompanying promise was of equal extent. Ultimately, Carey wanted to know, hey, what we would call the Great Commission, is that still binding on us today? Are we still all called to go to the ends of the earth? Now, you might hear that and say, well, like, of course, what are you talking about? It's the Great Commission. It's not the small commission. It's the Great Commission. We're all called to go. But at the time, believe it or not, the majority view in the particular Baptist denomination he was in believed that the Great Commission had been fulfilled already by the apostles, that they were not responsible for going to the ends of the earth anymore. The apostles already did it. Once Carey asked this question, one of the older pastors of the time stood up and said, young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine. Now, we would rightly agree that we are Calvinistic in our understanding of how God saves his people. But the problem of Carey's day was that they took that to the extreme extent to what we would now call hyper-Calvinism. That they went so far to say, the Lord's going to do the work. I'm just going to live my faithful Christian life here. I don't need to go anywhere. I don't need to burden myself. The Lord's going to save his people. I can just kind of sit back and live my life faithfully. The argument went something like this from the hyper-Calvinist perspective. Paul and the apostles did this. They went out. They fulfilled the command in Matthew 28:19. The nations refused the gospel, just like in the book of Acts where the apostles would go out and preach the gospel to a new city. If the gospel was rejected, they would wipe off the dust from their feet and move on to the next town. They would understand that same way of thinking, but to the nations. This is what the nations did. They rejected the gospel by the apostles. So because of that, and the apostles fulfilling this command, we're no longer responsible for going to the ends of the earth. So we can just disciple the people who are close to us, who are convenient, and that's that. Believe it or not, that was the majority view of the time, which we might hear today and be like, that's kind of wild, really? So what I wanted us to do here, because this is a pivotal moment in Carey's life. This is what really, he had a little fire burning in his heart. From dealing with this theological topic is what stoked his fire. It's what threw the gasoline on the fire in his heart to get out into the mission field. This is ultimately the starting point of what drove him to get out into the field that would take him and his young family on a 5-month ship ride to India, to where he would live the rest of his life. This topic, so on your handouts, on the back of them, I have a little, almost like a little worksheet. You should have a few paragraphs with some scripture references here. This is the hyper-Calvinist view, what we would call the hyper-Calvinist view in our age today. But this is the common viewpoint that Carey was speaking into to the Baptists of his time. So what I want us to do here, before I tell you how William Carey responded to this and what ultimately drove him into the missions field, I want you all on your own, maybe in groups, spend the next couple minutes working through this, read the 2 paragraphs I wrote here just to briefly summarize the argument, then look up the 3 supporting texts the Baptists of the time would use to support their viewpoint. Matthew 28, 18 through 20, Mark 16, 20, and Colossians 1:23. And then I want to hear from you, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this viewpoint? I want to give you guys a couple minutes. So on the back, you should have that sheet. If you don't, we should have more in the back, Lord willing. And then we'll come back. I'll tell you what Carey had to say about it, and then ultimately how this caused him to be driven into the mission field. So we could probably spend another 10 minutes, if not a whole lesson, diving into this theological controversy. I wanted to just kind of wet your whistle, though, and get you thinking in the mindset of William Carey. This is what the majority view of the Baptist denomination he was a part of, the particular Baptists, the more Calvinistic Baptists of their day, held. There's a few other arguments they'd make. There was a leading theologian at the time that would argue the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11, that gospel wouldn't actually be completely fulfilled in going out until they actually come and witness to the rest of the world. A few other kind of wonky theological perspectives that were out there leading this idea. Well, I'd like to direct your attention to Carey's response. Carey wasn't known for being a very big theologian. He wrote, the only published writing he ever wrote was a little pamphlet, about a 20-page response to this critique of his pastors, his local pastor friends. The little pamphlet he wrote, wasn't even a book, it was about 20 pages big, was called The Inquiry. The full title of this work he wrote was called The Obligation for Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. He published that in 1792, 1 year before he went out to do missions work. The Inquiry was broken up into 5 sections. The first section was dealing with this theological controversy, though. Carey wrote this mainly in mind with the pastors of his day and age to be able to critique this, because he knew if he was going to win people over to go to potentially move halfway across the world at the start of the 1800s, that he was going to need more than just a charismatic response. He was going to need something that was convictional from biblical doctrine. So he used the Bible to argue his point here. He knew if he was going to see true change in these people's hearts, it would have to come from the Scripture, not his opinion, not the opinion of man. His answer was rather simple. He looked at Matthew 28, 18 through 20, and he made several observations on the text. He said, well, if we're not responsible for going anymore, and the apostles completed this or fulfilled it, then I guess when this passage says we should also be baptizing people, then we don't need to be doing that anymore either, right? He's speaking to a bunch of Baptists. Like, come on, what? No, that's what we do. And he also said, well, it says we also should be teaching them. So I guess we don't need to be teaching them anymore, pastors, right? It's already been fulfilled. And then we'd all go, oh, well, of course not. What are you talking about? That's all we do. And then the last observation, which we started to see here, the promise that at the end of verse 20, I am with you always, even to the ends of the age. He said, this is a quote, finally Christ's promise to be with his church till the end of time made little sense if the command to evangelize the world was to be completed by the end of the 1st century. God promised to be with his people always, to go and do this work. His argument was, this text wasn't just for the apostles, it's for Christians throughout all history until the Lord's return. This is what sparked the fire in Carey. This is what he then published soon after a work in 1792, his inquiry, his little book, and shared it with his other pastors around him. And this is what began to get them to start changing their mindset on this, their theological stance. They realized, wait a minute, no, there's something to this. Maybe we've been wrong. Around the same time as Carey is wrestling with being a pastor, shepherding a small church in his area, He became friends and grew in friendships with a lot of famous pastors that we still look back and read stories on today, like one of them being Andrew Fuller. He's a known theologian at the time, really good friends with Carey, many others. But he met another man, another friendship that he would have the rest of his life, named John Thomas. He was a doctor, he was a surgeon, and he served in India. Around this time, on his way back, on his long 5-month ship ride back to England, this surgeon, this doctor, came to faith by someone sharing the gospel with him on the ship ride back. He came to faith, and as soon as he gets to England, he says, I need to know the pastors that are around here. So he gets a hold of Andrew Fuller. He was kind of one of the bigger names at the time, and Andrew Fuller is like, oh, you're coming from another country, and you just came to faith? He's telling him stories about how there's no Christianity in India, and the people are so desperate for the word in their language and all these other things. He's like, I got to get you connected to my friend. His name's William Carey. He writes him a letter. Carey meets with him, and Carey then sees an opening that he hasn't seen yet. He saw an opening for him to be able to go to India under the guidance of this doctor, because India didn't want missionaries coming and going. India is mainly a Muslim and Hindu country. They didn't want any other religions coming in because they're like, oh, you guys are going to stir up the pot. Everyone's going to hate each other if you come in here. We already have enough problems as is. So Carey was able to come under John, we can call him Dr. Thomas, and get into the country. But Carey knew even with this in, he still couldn't do it alone. He needed a team. He needed a team. So what Carey ended up doing was establishing, from this point on, what we now call the Baptist Missionary Society. This was the first organized group of like-minded believers, just 14 men to start with, in their area, with the goal of sending out missionaries and supporting them. If you're like me and grew up Southern Baptist, you can kind of trace the International Mission Board, still the biggest mission board that sends out missionaries to this day. You can trace their lineage all the way back to this group. It's kind of cool. But ultimately, this is the first group of Christians that came together and said, hey, we should come together, put all our money, effort, and prayer and support together so we can send out people to the nations. Carey led this, as well as many other pastors, one being Andrew Fuller, several other men that we could go on and on. They need their own Sunday school lesson on, but they established this right after, 1 year after the publishing of Carey's work, the Inquiry. In 1792, the Baptist Mission Society was established, and then come June of 1793, so about 1 year later, Carey and his family and Dr. Thomas left to go back to England on a 5-month-long trip on a ship to England. Carey was in his late 20s, young family, married. As I'm studying this, I look at my wife, Shannon, and I was like, babe, imagine if we got on a ship with our kids, and I said, hey, we're going to a place we don't even know the language. We know pretty much nothing about. We don't know the language. We don't know the culture. We don't know what I'll do for work. We don't know where we'll live. I don't even know how long it's going to take to get there, but we're going to go. And she looked at me and smiled and said, oh, yep. Good thing we're not doing that. But no, it was a serious task that they took on. So we're going to transition to the first 7 years of Carey's mission work in India. This is where he lands in India. There's a lot of things you need to understand. There's so much here. I'm just going to go overviewing it pretty broadly here for time's sake, just to get you guys an understanding of what happened in India. The first 7 years of Carey's life in India was hard. Probably the hardest time frame in his life. He gets to India after 5 months of traveling. He had some money saved up from the mission board that sent him. That dries up in weeks. He gets to India and finds that he can't get any work because the people of India did not want to hire him. Doesn't speak the language, different religion, no skill set that was desirable for the people at the time. He ran into just people not wanting to hire him because he was just some white European guy coming in there. We want nothing to do with you. The culture is very Muslim and Hindu. They are very in their own groups. They wanted nothing to do with anyone else. They get there, a few weeks goes by, money dries up. They're living out in the jungle in a hut. John Thomas, the doctor, ends up leaving the missions work. He gets there, he's excited, he's a new convert. He's like, I can't wait to get on board with this. Goes through a few weeks of trials and says, oh, okay, I'm just going to go be a doctor like I was doing before. This is too much. I'm out. We're going to see him pop up again. This Dr. Thomas seemed like a strange guy. He would do some extreme things like deserting Carey and his team, but he still stayed connected with Carey if you read into him. But all we need to know for now is that he left Carey and his family struggling. He said, I'm going to stop doing this mission work. I'll just focus on being a surgeon. Carey struggled to find work for the first year and a half until he met up with another European who owned an indigo factory. So he moved to go be a manager at an indigo factory. He moves there about a year and a half after being in India and starts getting some stable income coming in, so they're able to live. At very least, they're able to live now. A whole year and a half goes by. It's a long time. We're not talking a few weeks. They move here, and you would think, okay, good. They finally have their feet landed. They can start getting to work. Soon after moving, Carey's oldest son, Peter, dies. His wife begins to go insane, literally crazy. And you got to think of the context. Especially with his wife, Dorothy, she did not want to go to India to begin with. If you look at her life, she grew up close to where William Carey was, but she didn't want to go to India. It took William Carey a year from the publishing of the inquiry, meeting this Dr. Thomas. It took her roughly a year of just convincing her, hey, we should go. She was the only thing that held him back from going sooner. She said, no, I don't want to go. Why would I move halfway across the world? You're a pastor here. Can't you just do ministry here? It wasn't until Dr. Thomas convinced her to go because she had a younger sister she was best friends with, and their younger sister agreed to go with them. That was the only thing that compelled her to feel comfortable to go. But you have to feel for her. They're in the middle of India, living in a jungle. Her husband, Carey, was a manager at an indigo factory. He would have to leave for weeks at a time for work and not return. She's living in the middle of a jungle, doesn't know the language, doesn't know anybody, has her sister there at least. She starts to go insane. She starts hallucinating. She thinks William Carey is leaving and going and cheating on her, committing adultery while he's gone. He comes back. She tries to kill him several times. She tries to run away. Carey's chasing her down in the jungle to try to bring her back, all while having a young family. And then your job requires you to have to leave for several weeks at a time and not knowing what's going on with your family while you're gone. Talk about a hard time. And in the midst of this, his oldest son dies. And it was said that William Carey's wife was, as any mother would be, was destroyed at this point. And no one around her would help even dig a grave. Not until a few days go by and this young boy's corpse starts decaying until a few Muslim men finally said, all right, we had enough, we'll dig a hole for you at least. But imagine that. Carey faced such extreme hardship. If there's ever a person that would return from the mission field and you'd hear their story, you'd be like, all right, you deserve to come back, man. Goodness, you went through a hard time. But William Carey persevered through this. This is a 7-year period. For several more years, he continued to do this work, tried to take care of his family the best he could. Really, the only shining good thing that came out of this is he started to translate the Bible and he started to learn the language of the Indian people. Carey, again, started at a young age learning Latin. Soon after becoming ordained, he started to teach himself Greek and Hebrew. And now he's learning the language of the people of India. And then by 1797, he's able to now have the whole New Testament on his own, translate it into this language. He was able to do that while working as a manager at this indigo factory. But he saw that if the people needed anything, the people needed the word in their language. By the end of Carey's life, as we'll see here in a little bit, he's responsible for 6 of the major languages in India being translated, the whole Bible being translated in their language. 6 languages. I barely know English, and this guy's doing 6 languages. He didn't even go to college. He didn't go to seminary. This guy's guy's a high school dropout. But this is his work for the 7 years. No converts. This is a key. You're going on a mission trip. Think of this. If any of us went on a mission trip and you're in a place away from everyone you know, the only communication you have is by writing letters, and it takes 4 to 6 months to get a letter back and get a letter to send and come back. It's not like texting. It's not like we have the internet to look up things. It's not like we can pop open our phones and be like, hey, what's India look like? You know, or I can pull up Google Translate if I run into somebody I don't know the language of. None of that. So 7 years of this hard work, beginning to study the language and translating the Bible. We see the shift come in 1800. This is what transfers us to the next point here. The Serampore Missions Community. William Carey knew he was in a tough place with his family, his wife going insane, literally insane, his young boys becoming more and more unruly as he saw when he would come back from work. You can imagine, your mom's going insane. She's not doing much parenting. So he said, what should I do? He's writing letters back to Andrew Fuller at the time. Again, it takes months to get back and forth. So finally, the Missionary Society learns of his problems, and in 1800 send help. Carey moved to about 12 miles outside of what we would call modern-day Calcutta in India to establish a missionary homestead or a community. He did this with the help of the missionary group sending several other missionaries to help with him. These are important names, and again, friendships that would be monumental changes in William Carey's ministry. We see them send several people. William Ward is one of them, and then Joshua and Hannah Marshman. They came to aid Carey in 1800. Joshua Marshman was known as being a bold apologist and bold preacher. His wife came with him. They were a young family, similar to Carey's age. And then William Ward, maybe the most undervalued person of the group, but probably the biggest impact in his ministry. William Ward had a specific set of skills that made Carey's ministry monumental to the Indian people. William Ward wasn't some brilliant theologian or anything. He just had a desire to serve the Lord, but he came from the trade of working in printing. He worked at a printing press. Now, in England, they had that for some time. In India, they had none. They had no modern way of printing. So the Missionary Society said, hey, we know this guy who can come. He brought some broken down equipment to help with printing, and he comes to aid Carey. He comes to aid Carey. Joshua Marshman and his wife then become almost the surrogate parents of William Carey's sons who are not being mothered by their mom because she's half insane. They start taking care of the kids. William Ward comes with his printing equipment and says, now we can start printing the Bible in the language here. Huge movement in the history here. Right when they arrive, several months after they start getting to printing, they start getting to finishing the work of being able to publish a Bible in the language of the Indian people. This is where we first see the Lord begin to really move. It's not until the word is able to get out into their language until we see the first convert. We see somebody come to Christ. The first person that came to Christ under their work was by the name of Krishna Paul. He was a carpenter. So Carey and his team, they move. They kind of start this own like missionary homestead. This guy, he's a carpenter. He's washing in the local river, like behind their house, and he falls while he's washing in a river and dislocates his shoulder. So he's like, oh, great, I dislocated my shoulder. What do I do? So he goes and knocks on the closest building to him, and it's Carey and his team where they're living. They bring him in, and they have a freshly translated word to give him. He was in Hindu. He grew up Hindu. Carey and his team were able to pop his shoulder back in and share the scriptures with him. Roughly 1 month after this encounter, Krishna Paul came to faith and was baptized. He was baptized in the same river he fell and dislocated his shoulder in, funny enough. But he was baptized in front of a bunch of Muslims and Hindus. He would be attacked for his faith. They tried to kill him. They tried to burn down his house. They wanted nothing to do with this white man religion. But Krishna Paul was used by God. He was baptized, and shortly after that, he became a preacher. He would then lead his wife, his daughters, and sister, and fellow neighbors around him to Christ. Some historians can even trace his work back and Carey's work through translating the word to planting over 20 churches in the area. 20 churches. And again, the crazy note here is the Lord didn't start to move and save people until the word got out in the people's language. 7 years of toiling until finally a New Testament could be written and understood in this language. And then the Lord said, okay, people are going to start coming to faith. Started with Krishna Paul, the carpenter. From the time span of 1801 to 1821, they saw over 1,400 people come to Christ, many of which were from the preaching of Krishna Paul, the carpenter. He was known for preaching 12 to 14 times a week throughout his life until he died. Imagine that. It was hard enough for me to come up with this lesson on William Carey, let alone teach 12 to 14 times a week. And this is where we really see Carey, I think, come into grips with his calling. Just for time's sake, the quick bullet points here. This is really the shift. The first 7 years were like the 7 years of torment. The rest of Carey's life, he starts to see everything start to click for him. In 1801, Carey became a teacher at a local college to train Englishmen. They came to him and said, hey, you pretty much know all our languages. Can you teach all these other Europeans coming over that want to do business here? Can you teach them our languages? He said, sure. He ultimately became the dean of the school. He worked there for 30 years as he's continued his translating work. Carey's wife, Dorothy, the one who had struggled, literally going insane, ends up dying in 1807. She passes away. Carey remarries a year later. He has 3 sons. They all come to faith, and they ultimately become missionaries. Very little are written on them. We just know they go out to the surrounding island places of India and spread the gospel. Very little is written on them. Very little. But they go out to do what their dad did. Carey ultimately saw the most effective way to evangelize and spread the gospel is by getting the word in the people's language. Again, he was responsible for over the 6 major languages that they spoke in India, translating the full Bible into their 6 languages, as well as starting up to 29 others. Can you imagine that? It's said at this point in history, 43% of total first Bible translations in people's languages came from Carey and his team. 43% of total Bible translations. And this was all because of William Ward, the printer guy. He came with his equipment and said, hey, Carey, I can publish these Bibles now. We can print them. The Missionary Society can fund this. We have a team. It can all come together and work. By 1818, the Bibles are being translated. Carey founds his own college, pretty much a seminary at the time, to train other local men for ministry. He understood the most effective way, as he saw with Krishna Paul, the carpenter, is to train local men in that nation, in that country, to go out and make disciples. So he did that. He started his own school. He's translating, he's teaching, he's training up other men to be pastors and missionaries. This is William Carey's life. This is what he did until the day he died, until 1834. Where he died. His tombstone says, a somewhat poetic but also humbling statement. He only wanted one thing on his tombstone other than his name, and it says this: a wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall. William Carey left England never to return. Most missionaries are able to travel back home. He lived and died in India. His tomb is still there, or his grave is still there. But the Lord used him even through such hardship, 7 years of hard labor, hard family dynamic, hardship, 7 years. I haven't even been married 7 years yet. Yeah, my life is so different since then. 7 years, though, is such a long time. But the Lord used him. The Lord used him and his skill set to save and to get his word out. That's ultimately it. Carey couldn't have done this without his friends. And the Lord accomplished his work, as we all know, through his word. And we see that faithfully in Carey's life. Carey was no perfect man by any means. You can really nitpick his life and see a lot of things you're like, ooh, that's not good. But the Lord is faithful through the working of his word. So to end here, by application, really just want us to ask two real simple questions here. Carey couldn't have done any of this without his team, without his friends. So I wanted to ask you guys, who are your friends? You're probably thinking, oh, a lot of my friends are from church, or they're Christians, which I hope, Lord willing. William Carey couldn't have done this without his friends. But beyond that, I would want to challenge you and ask you this. What have you done, or what could you do with your friends to advance the gospel together? Every friendship you have is intentionally placed there by the Lord. We see that with William Carey. So how are you guys advancing the gospel with your friendship? With your Bible studies, with our Wednesday night studies? People you share every week with? How can you serve together to go to the ends of the earth and make disciples? That's what I wanted to leave you guys with. And that's it on William Carey. Much more can be said. He did a lot more. But for time's sake, that's where we can end. Any questions on William Carey's life? Any thoughts? There's a lot of information given. Luke?
Did the church that he was a part of, did their ideas change? Like did he have a whole effect on the people you refer to as hyper-Calvinists?
They did, yeah. We really see that viewpoint somewhat still existing, but it really began to die out, especially as technology advanced, time went on, and it was more easy to travel. I think with that and just hearing the works of people like William Carey and other missionaries around the time really showed people who held to that view, oh, the Lord's using them in mighty ways. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Brady?
Do you know what you said there's a seminary planted or the churches being planted. Do you know what they're doing today in India?
Yeah. If you look them up, their school changed names a little bit. If you look up the, I'm probably mispronouncing this, the Serampore College, it's still in India. And by God's grace, just like with most schools, it went through a time of liberalism in the last recent history, but their most recent president of a few years ago was evangelical Baptist. So his school he started, the first Christian school in India, is still there. It's still training up men. It's really cool. Yeah, I got on their website. Now, granted, it's in a language I don't know, so but it's still there. But yes, yeah. Hrinda in the back.
What was your favorite resource or book that you read about blood?
Oh, goodness. Oh, well, I think there's a lot of resources on William Carey, a ton, probably more than most missionaries. Stephen got me a book written by a professor named Dr. Haken. That was really helpful. I'm forgetting the name of it. It was just a biography of William Carey. And then I also listened to some lectures from Dr. Haken. He's a history professor at a seminary.
Fellowship? What the name of it?
It's probably, yeah, that sounds about right. The Missionary Fellowship. But those lectures are really insightful because there's so much to be said here on this man. But again, it all goes back to he just wanted to get the word out to the people, and the Lord worked. The Lord did it. He wanted the people to understand the word in their language, and he put the hard work in to do it. And the Lord rewarded it. So, but for that, we can go ahead and end in prayer. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask me here afterwards. But let's go ahead and go to the Lord, and then we'll end. Father, we come before you, Lord, thanking you that you have used such men like William Carey and many others to advance the word, even through Krishna Paul, who was just trying to take a bath in a river and fell and dislocated his shoulder. Lord, you would use even crazy moments like that significantly, sovereignly, to bring us to where you want us. So, Lord, I pray for us today that you will use us, that all the relationships we have within the church and out of it, Lord, that we will think of them intentionally. And everything has been placed here for a reason through those. So, Lord, help us to go to the ends of the earth, whether we are going like William Carey or staying like Andrew Fuller and the Missionary Society did to support, that we will be a part of missions, that you will continue to do your work through your word as you have in our lives and many others. Help us to be faithful with what you've given us, and I pray we'll do this all for your glory. We pray this in your name. Amen.